Well, hello, everyone, and welcome once again to this month's edition of the Coach's Corner, sponsored by Performance Experts Coaching. I'm your host, Tim Brahim, and here we are in the month of November and rounding out the year, and I am so grateful and excited for the opportunity to interview the guest that I have in today's call. I want to tell you a little bit about Gay Hendricks. I have a very interesting little personal history with him that I won't get into, but for those of you that are listening to this call that are in the mortgage business, which I know is a high percentage of the people, I actually did Gay and his wife Katie's mortgage loan back in 2001, so 13 years ago. And although we never developed a personal relationship or even met for that matter, here I am interviewing him as a result of my deep interest and fascination in a couple of his books that I've read, Conscious Loving and The Big Leap. And The Big Leap is one that we're going to talk a lot about today. Many of you have heard me mention this book for quite some time now, probably for about a year to a year and a half. I've been in various interviews that I've done with Dave Savage and the Mortgage Coach, etc. I've been telling everybody to go out and read this book. And so it's just been really great for me to have the opportunity to interview Gay. Gay Hendricks is a Ph.D. and has been a leader in the field of relationship transformation and body-mind therapy for over 45 years. He graduated from Stanford University, and he has authored or co-authored with his wife Katie 35 books. I mentioned Conscious Loving before. For me, it's the single best book I've ever read on the subject matter of relationships, and I had to read it as a part of my schooling at the University of Santa Monica. Gay is co-founded the Spiritual Cinema Circle, which distributes inspirational movies and conscious entertainment to subscribers in over 70 countries. A great documentary for you to take note of, to go watch, is a documentary called Finding Joe. It's about the great anthropologist Joseph Campbell, and Gay is a very prominent person in that documentary. He's been featured on Oprah, CNN, CNBC, 48 Hours, and others. Some of his strengths: he sees the genius and the essence in people, and the core pattern blocking the direct experience of essence in a very, very brief period of time. And lastly, and perhaps his greatest strength, as I understand it from what his wife Katie has to say, is he's an absolutely outstanding pancake flipper with a single skillet. So, Gay, that's quite an accomplishment that you have there, and thanks so much for taking the opportunity to join us in the Coach's Corner. I'm so excited to interview you today.
Well, thanks a lot, Tim. It's my pleasure. And also, I should mention that Katie and I just are celebrating our 33rd wedding anniversary this month. So it comes, our conversation comes at a very timely time.
Well, congratulations on that. And I know a few people who have gone through yours and Katie's training, and I won't mention their names for the purposes of privacy. But I know quite a few people who have gone up to Ojai and spent considerable amounts of time learning from the two of you, and everybody speaks so very highly of you, which is not a surprise after having read your book. So let's dive in. I want to go straight to the subject matter, deep in the heart of the book, The Big Leap, which is the issue of upper limits issues or upper limits beliefs. So you speak in The Big Leap about upper limit beliefs that we hold in our consciousness and how they affect us in our personal and business life. For those that have not read the book, please explain in a high-level overview what an upper limit belief is, and perhaps give us a couple of examples of common ones that you see in people that really inhibit their ability to achieve success, Gay.
Well, first of all, most of these beliefs that really limit us are unconscious in the sense that we're not readily aware of them until something happens that kind of jolts us loose from that unconscious belief system for a moment so that we can see that it's just a belief. So, for example, a common one for successful people is that even though they're fairly successful, they could be a lot more successful if they weren't trapped behind four basic fears. And those fears are the fuel for these unconscious limiting beliefs. So the book The Big Leap, kind of dismantles that whole process and shows you how it works. But just kind of in summary, the big problem that human beings run up against is that we've got tons of strategies from millions of years of evolution for dealing with pain, but we as yet don't have a very well-developed nervous system for how to handle expanding degrees of pleasure, success, connection with the universe, love, connection with other people. We haven't grown a nervous system yet that can handle as much as we have possibly opened up to these days. And so we're trying very much to grow a new nervous system. I think conscious people are growing a new nervous system that allows them to experience more and more and more success and positive energy, and just organically as a result of the way they are, not necessarily anything they have to do. And so I have seen in my life that once I began to dismantle these four big fears, then I began to be able to see my upper limits almost as they came up so I could avoid them and go past them. One of the biggest fears, Tim, is the fear of outshining someone else. And these fears are often installed when we're very young, and often with brothers and sisters, not necessarily with your parents. But so, for example, if you have a fear of that you're not supposed to outshine one of your siblings. I've worked with literally hundreds of people that uncovered that fear in themselves. And so that can really limit you later on, because you come up against a bigger success, and then that unconscious belief that says, no, I must not outshine others, comes into play, and you shrink back into that earlier level of existence. But that's just one of them. I'd be delighted to tell you about more. Is this a direction you'd like our conversation to go in, Tim?
Without question, and thank you. And I'd like to just briefly summarize that for the audience, because I know that this really hits home with a lot of them. I work with and coach quite a few people, Gay, that seem to hit this glass ceiling, let's say in income or in production within their business. And there's almost a self-sabotaging pattern, or there is a self-sabotaging pattern that actually is the undercurrent that hits this glass ceiling. So it's like as soon as you get to that point where you're about really ready to break through and take it to the next level in your prosperity and in your abundance, it's almost like there's things that take place in the subconscious that start to just sabotage that success. And what I'm hearing you say is that this is one of the common beliefs that can create that. Is that not correct?
That is absolutely correct. And a more fundamental one, too, that so many people have is the unconscious belief that there's something wrong with them, or they're fundamentally bad, or have done something wrong, or feel just fundamentally guilty about being here. And so many, even top-level executives I've worked with, have uncovered that aspect of themselves. And it really makes a difference, because if you feel somehow unconsciously that you're fundamentally wrong or bad or don't deserve to be here, then that can color every moment of your existence, and it gives fuel to beliefs like, I must not be more successful, because if I do, I'll just expose more of my fundamental badness to the world. And so that's one of those old beliefs. Now, not everybody has all four of them, but, some of us have one of them or two of them. But, the four biggest ones have to do, like the earlier one I mentioned about outshining, and then this one about being fundamentally wrong or bad in some way. There are a couple of others that are important. One is the fear of being disloyal to or leaving behind people if you expand to your full level of success. And so if you go beyond, if you exceed that upper limit, then you're kind of dragged back down by that belief that says, if I get any more successful, I'm going to be disloyal to the family belief systems, or I'm going to be disloyal to people in my life who limit me. So there's a tremendous surge as you get more successful of confrontations that you need to have on the social level with other friends and family and people like that. So you need to kind of go out of your way to elicit support for your genius. I talk a lot about your ultimate goal in the Big Leap is to open up to your organic genius, the natural, unique abilities that are not only most valuable to you in terms of abundance, but also incredibly nurturing to your soul. So when you find those genius aspects of you, they really serve you in so many ways by increasing your abundance naturally, but also just by developing that deep, good feeling of, I'm doing what I came here to do.
I want to take our conversation ultimately to the subject matter of working within our genius, because yes, it is a very big theme in the Big Leap, and in fact, I have a 1-year coaching program where I work with a small group of business professionals, and we spend a tremendous amount of time. In fact, in that program, your book is a required reading because we do spend so much time working within the genius and working on these upper limit beliefs issues. But before we move on, something just kind of popped into my consciousness that I need to ask you, because to me this is a very big question that I think could help a lot of people on this call. So what I just heard you say right now as it relates to the subject matter of running into that glass ceiling, that upper limit belief that you may be holding about outshining others, I mean, that could kind of take on the form, correct me if I'm wrong, Gay, of, like my mom and dad kind of pounded into my head when I was younger that if I have too much prosperity like the neighbors down the street, I may somehow lose myself and forget where I came from. So then I'm holding this belief that like people that are extremely successful then kind of lose their soul or lose their consciousness and forget where they came from and become disloyal, and I'm carrying that around with me, and that's kind of a belief that I'm holding that I keep hitting up against. But what about the inverse? So here's the inverse that I see a lot. Successful, wildly successful business person, but very out of balance in terms of their personal life, meaning that they've figured out a way to win on a financial basis within the construct of their business, but then lack presence, lack connection with their family, etc. And the belief that I see very often is that, and pardon the expression, if I don't beat the hell out of myself consistently and judge myself consistently and push myself consistently, that I will then become complacent and I will lose everything. Is that something that you've seen before? And if so, what would your advice be to working with someone on that level who's so incredibly hard on themselves that they're driving themselves to this place of imbalance and lack of connection?
Well, yes, indeed. In fact, I've worked with probably hundreds of people like that, because for a long time, a lot of my practice back in the 80s and 90s were business people. I coached Michael Dell and his executive team for a while, and also some of the folks at Monsanto when they were trying to transition to a more environmentally friendly company, and lots of places like that, AT&T. I had the opportunity to work with a lot of people with what you'd call big egos, I guess. And so what you're talking about is incredibly, it's almost a disease across the culture of business, isn't it? I mean, it seems to me that, well, here's the way I explain it. Up until about age 40, you're building up this persona that knows how to grapple effectively in the world and make money, and you're getting there through the what I call personality number one, which is your desire to shine, your desire to succeed, your desire to have the abundance of life and enjoy the freedom of it, and those kinds of values. And I wholly support all those values. I've tasted them all, and I enjoy them all. And so I recommend highly, though, that people first take a good look at what they're doing this whole thing for. In other words, what are we in the enterprise of business for, and what are we in the enterprise of life for? And as I've opened up that dialogue with a lot of really, really brilliant people who do big things in the world, inevitably they come down to a kind of love. And I want to have in the business world us speak more freely about that, because you mentioned your past career or maybe current career as a mortgage broker. Well, if you get down to the basics of what a mortgage broker does, I mean, isn't it all grounded in love? You're helping people get into a house that will make them feel like they're having a better experience of life. And that's a form of love to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what we need to do, first of all, to access our genius, is to stop doing the things that are not within our zone of genius. So, for example, when I worked with people, even big CEO, very powerful, successful people back in the 80s and the 90s, I kind of quit traveling in this century I do most of my work on Skype, and we have a 2-year training program here, but people come here to do it in Southern California rather than us going to them. And so we over the past 10 years have kind of begun to minimize our travel. We've kind of found our piece of paradise, which, bless you, you helped us find here, this wonderful home that we've loved since the moment I set foot in it and still continue to love. And so I think, though, people have to quit doing the things that are not in their zone of genius. And these have to do with getting out of your zone of incompetence, where you're doing things that you're not very good at. And a second one is getting out of your zone of competence and ultimately even your zone of excellence. Because I've worked with, I would guess, about 300 attorneys over the last 45 years, and people around midlife who have come in basically with the same story. And it is that the personality that got me here to being a successful attorney at age 40 is now costing me all of my relationships that are dear to me. And so what am I supposed to do? If I quit being a successful attorney, I'm going to miss that $500,000 a year. Mm-hmm. And what do? You know, I can't just follow my bliss. I've got this whole enterprise to support. So it's a big dilemma that many people face at midlife. But the bottom line is that you don't have to dismantle completely the personality that got you here. You just need to go deeper and wider and bigger to expand so that you can embrace that personality in this larger field of spiritual awareness that I believe every human being has access to.
So let me dig a little deeper with your answer. So let's take an individual, just a hypothetical individual, very successful, doesn't have the connection that they would like to have in their life, doesn't have a real strong relationship even with themselves. Their identity is highly caught up in the personality of being successful, which they've figured out how to achieve. And there's a fear, and it's probably one of the 4 fears, or a different fear even of, but there is a definitive fear that I see that if I take my foot off the gas pedal just a little bit to cultivate this other side that you're referring to of love and connection and purpose and service to humanity, that if I take a little bit of the foot off the gas and I start to come home, say, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that I'm going to lose everything, because everything that I've achieved over the last 25, 30 years has been because I've been so driven and so hard on myself and really pushed myself to greatness. And so to give us an idea as to how this works with finding an upper limit belief, let's assume that the belief here for this moment is if I am to go a little easy on myself, that the result of it will be that I will lose what I have, which may also include my whole identity of who I am. How would you work with somebody on that? Like, what's the process and the technique that you would advise the listeners to employ in terms of finding the belief and then working on the reframing process and maybe the mantra process that you talk about in the book? Could you just briefly describe that to us?
Yes, I go about it in a very different way. For example, going home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon is a noble idea, but it's an adjustment that takes place in the Newtonian world, where you're trying to make an adjustment in the material world that will then create an altered state of consciousness in you. And in my experience, people have very little success with doing it that way because it requires a certain amount of discipline, and it's just not something people organically tend to do. So I haven't had good success with that kind of thing. What I have major success with is a kind of a post-Einsteinian solution to it, which is to invite people first, not to try to cut back on anything or do anything, but simply to designate 10 minutes a day to devote to their genius. Mm. And it has a certain effect. First of all, 10 minutes is pretty easy for people to commit to, and I actually will sit there with them and plot it out on their calendar or their iPhone or whatever they're using, and get that 10 minutes actually sequenced into the day at convenient times. So the practical value of that is that I cannot count the number of executives that told me some version of, if I could just get 10 minutes to myself to think, I know I could solve a lot of problems, but I never get that 10 minutes to think. But the thing is, if you devote 10 minutes a day, for starters, to focusing on your genius, to focusing on your unique abilities, to focusing on what you most love to do, that 10 minutes begins to expand and feel like a lot more than 10 minutes. Because remember Einstein's wonderful example about the theory of relativity. He said that a minute on a hot stove feels like an hour, but an hour with your beloved goes by like a minute. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the level of expansion of your awareness in that situation. When you're sitting on a hot stove, you're withdrawing your awareness with all your might from the heat of the stove, and so the time goes by very slowly. But if you're with your beloved, then you're in that expanded, exalted state of love, and in that state there is no time. Time doesn't factor into it, and so an hour can go by just like whoosh. So in The Big Leap, I, in fact, have a whole chapter on what I call Einstein time, which I encourage people to really, it's the one chapter that I have people come up and stop me on the street to ask me about. So I know it has a major impact in people's lives. And one of the things they tell me when they stop me on the street is they were unable to finish that chapter because it kind of pushed too many buttons in them. But what I invite people to do is take charge of being where time comes from. Instead of being the victim of time, you can't count how many times you hear people say, "Oh, I've got to run," or "Gee, I wish I had more time, but I can't," or "Gosh, I'm late for," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's woven into our conversation to be the victim rather than the constructors of time. And so it's to our advantage to expand to the level of being where time comes from so that you step out of that whole victim relationship with it and be a producer rather than a consumer of time. And I know it sounds weird, but you really have to kind of give it a try. And if you've had trouble getting through that chapter, I understand. It took me 30 years of careful thinking to figure out how to write that chapter, and I can't count the number of versions I discarded. But it's all in there. As much as I could get in The Big Leap was in there about how to construct your new life in your zone of genius. And first, you keep it simple. You designate 10 minutes a day to your genius. And if you don't know what your genius is, you spend that 10 minutes inquiring into it. Just maybe sketch it out on a piece of paper. My genius is, fill in the blank. Or hum it to yourself as a mantra. My genius is, and let your mind come up with ideas. What is my genius? Maybe turn it into a wonder question. That's what I do with my clients. I have them sit with me for 10 minutes and simply focus on a certain question. Like one of those questions is, what is my unique genius? And I ask them to keep repeating that and leaving about 15 seconds or so for their mind to come up with anything that comes up. Like if you say, what is my genius? And pause for 15 seconds, your mind may come up with some kind of negative chatter like, you don't have any genius, or something like that. And then you keep saying, what is my genius? And pretty soon, your mind begins to expand and open up and give you ideas. That's how I originally did it, was just kind of kept opening up to what it really was. And I kept getting hints of it. And then once I got it on the line, so to speak, and began to actually express it in my life and my business career and in my writing, then it became a question of gradually expanding the amount of time I lived in that zone of genius. And that has a whole psychology to it in itself that we can discuss too, Tim.
Well, and thank you for going to that place of the chapter on Einstein time. It was a radical shift in the entire view of time management for me, and I didn't have a difficult time reading it. In fact, your example about, I believe it was about if a child comes to you and they've cut themselves and all of that was just, it just really landed for me. Everybody on this call should certainly read the book and read that chapter, because I think it is a radical shift in the way that we view time, and I'm really grateful for you sharing it. To summarize, what I heard you say is that for somebody who's really hard on themselves, really driving themselves hard and has found success, it's less about trying to eradicate that mentality and to try to, say, get home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they're used to getting home at 7, and a lot more, in your view, about where they're spending their time energetically and emotionally within themselves. So if they're spending much more of their time starting with that little 10-minute block that's easy to implement, I like how you eat the elephant one bite at a time, so to speak, that if you first start with spending 10 minutes working in that place that is your sweet spot, where time kind of stands still, where the activity is somewhat effortless for you because it's your unique ability, it's your gift that you were put into this lifetime with, that will subsequently expand, and it will become somewhat irrelevant as to how much you're working, because if you're truly in your gifted space most of your time during the day, that's what life is really meant to be, how it's meant to be lived. Is that essentially what you're saying?
That's essentially what I'm saying, and that if you can step into the position of ownership of being where time comes from, become the master of time, and start with simple things. Like if you say you're going to show up someplace at noon, show up exactly at noon. And that keeps you in integrity with the universe. That's a key fundamental with people, is to be in integrity with the fundamental laws in the universe. And, Tim, if I said to you, let's have lunch tomorrow at 2 p.m., and you said, okay, and if I couldn't get there, if I was stuck in traffic, I would do everything possible to get in touch with you and say, hey, I'm not going to be able to keep my agreement, because I don't want you to sit there at 2:01 wondering if I've been in a car wreck or whatever. And so it's grasping controls of time is such an amazing thing that it has such amazing power to it that, as a matter of fact, there was a famous time expert who came to have lunch at my house, and author of many books on the subject of time effectiveness and that kind of thing. And when I started talking to him about Einstein time, he actually turned pale. It was like his whole investment of his whole life was in this Newtonian realm, but the idea of going outside that was very threatening. And in a way, it brings to mind Fritz Perls' famous saying about fear is only excitement without the breath. Because if you're not willing to open up and kind of breathe with your fear and turn it into excitement, it doesn't feel very good. If you kind of clutch yourself and feel deeper in fear, it really starts to toxify your body very quickly. So, and adrenaline is a very powerful drug, and so the more we tend to clench ourselves and keep reality at bay, the more we manufacture that inner juice that propels us into anxiety and stress and those kinds of things. So it's important to be in touch with your own life energy, in the sense of when you feel the emanation of fear or anger or sadness or joy or whatever it is we're feeling, then to be real with that and to communicate that in an open-hearted way is one of those 10-second miracle moves that I think is important to weave throughout our business day.
So before we get into the final subject of this interview, which is I'd like you to go deeper on the subject matter of the genius and the zone of excellence, the zone of competence and incompetence, and maybe you can define those in a little bit more depth in a moment for us. And by the way, just as a side note, I think I knew who that time management expert is that you're referring to, and that individual actually coached me at one time, and that was why that chapter struck me so hard, because when I read it, it like really radically shifted my view. And I had been practicing that model for a very long time. And you're right, it's really about choice management more than anything else. I mean, that's really what time management is. As it relates to this issue of fear, before we get into the genius zone, if you can just, I'm intrigued by what you just said there about taking fear and making it your friend, essentially, the Fritz Perls theory of like how can we redirect that energy. And can you play with that a little bit more deeply for us on the subject matter of success? So somebody who, let's take as an example somebody who is in the profession of mortgage origination, and they're trying to develop a relationship with real estate agents to refer business to them, but they're afraid to approach these individuals because they're afraid of rejection, because it hits deeply on an undercurrent wound of like, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, they didn't like me, all of those types of things. So it's a fear that they're really holding on to and trying to approach these people, and therefore they avoid it because they don't want to experience that rejection. How would one work with that fear within themselves to make it their ally, so to speak, and turn it into excitement, as you referenced?
Yes, one of the things that comes to mind as you were mentioning that is a real estate fellow that I worked with some years ago that had a kind of upper limit ceiling on how much money he made. He kind of, if I remember correctly, I think it was like $137,000 a year, somewhere in that neighborhood, and he had a goal of making $200,000 a year on this segment of his business. And so he came in finally on urging of his wife, who happened to be a massage therapist, and his new wife. And so she spotted it as an upper limit problem and directed him to me. And so right away, it only took an hour or so for us to kind of unpack what the issue was. But it was the interesting thing. It was so clear to see to me, but he hadn't thought of it. And that's how these unconscious beliefs are. It turned out his father was also in the real estate business. And it hadn't occurred to him that he didn't want to unconsciously exceed his father's income. And his father had never made more than something like $140,000 a year in his career. And so my client, his son, who was around maybe 32 at the time, kept bumping up against the ceiling of $137,000. So when we worked on what that fear really was, it came down to a kind of a 10-minute conversation he needed to have with his dad. And interestingly enough, he had, there were certain things feelings he'd conceal from his dad, and things that he'd never said, and, things that were troubling to him, so that it was like a giant boulder in the middle of the stream of his success. He kept having to go around it or find some other path through. And so the interesting thing was how quickly it turned around. In fact, I didn't actually see him for a little while professionally, and I saw him at a July 4th parade, and he signaled to me, held up these two fingers, and then I didn't understand what that meant, and so it turned out he was referring to he had broken the $200,000 barrier. And so that's a succinct example of the kind of thing we're talking about, where there's an unconscious belief that I've got to hold myself back. I can't be disloyal to the family mechanism. or I can't outshine somebody else. Or the one I didn't mention that I wanted to be sure to mention is some people have a feeling of being a burden in this world. Maybe they were the 8th of 8 kids or something like that, so they got the communication that they were a burden. Or there's other situations where that can happen. There's an unconscious feeling of being a burden, so to be more successful would be to carry further that burden into the world. And so they keep themselves limited because they don't want to face that whole burden issue. But it's always just a belief that has come out of a certain experience. You know, an unconscious belief, there's nothing wrong with them. They were shaped to a certain experience where you actually had the feeling of not wanting to outshine a brother or sister, or feeling of being a burden, or feeling of being fundamentally wrong or bad. Those things just come with the territory, and you need to open up and find out what your version of that is, if you have a version of that. So, and if you're not successful completely to your own tastes, then obviously I would look into seeing what the upper limit there is.
So are you then saying, and I hope I'm not misunderstanding you, but I want to check in on this. So what I think I'm hearing you say is that, like, once you've uncovered the belief, probably the greatest way to dismantle or dissolve it is to really lean into it.
Yes.
Like in the case of this young man who then spoke to his father about it. So therefore, in the case of the example that I gave, what came to mind for me, and some coaching for those listening, it's like, what would it look like if you chose to sit down with a real estate agent and you kind of started off by saying, you know, what I'm aware of right now is that I'm feeling a little bit nervous because in the past I've kind of avoided having these kinds of meetings because I'm afraid of you not wanting to work with me, and then I feel rejected, like I'm not good enough. And I'd like to just get that out on the table. I mean, that's kind of like really leaning into the vulnerability and the fear, which would subsequently really dissolve it, I would think. And then to add to that, if they choose to not work with you, those of you listening, it might be really healthy for you to just simply ask why. Because a lot of the times what I find is that we make a lot of stories up in our head and assumptions about what the reasonings are behind things. And then those stories typically attach to these belief systems that are unconsciously held for many, many years that Gay's referring to. And the byproduct of it is we walk away and we assume, well, they don't want to work with us because we're not good enough. But the chances are very, very good that the reason that they didn't want to work with you is for something entirely different. Maybe they don't have a lot of business to give you. Maybe they currently have a loyal relationship with somebody else. So why leave yourself with that reinforcement of a belief that is really not proven in any fact? Do you have anything to comment on that, Gay, or do you think that's accurately advised to those that are listening?
I think that's well advised. And, you know, in the Big Leap also I have what I call that universal success mantra, which is a new idea that you can begin to implement that has the capability, too, of bringing forth your genius, which is to really lean into, as you say, what is your real life purpose? And it has to do with, for me anyway, that the sweetest, most noble purpose of life has to do with expanding in every moment in my ability to love and my openness to my creativity, my success, however you want to put it, that it's an expansion into what you are most here to do. And I know for me that my life purpose has to do with that I expand every day in love, creativity, and contribution. So that every day of my life, I want it to have that flavor of expansion, that every day I learn a little bit more about how to do those things, how to open up to my creativity. I'm almost 70 now, about to turn 70, and yet over the past 5 years, for example, I've written 4 or 5 detective novels that are now being published. I kind of invented a whole new career for myself as a mystery novelist. And so that was after a lifetime of writing other kinds of things like The Big Leap and Conscious Loving. But the point I'm making is that it's never too late for you to open up to whatever the new learning edge you have in yourself. Because to me, life at its very best is flavored always with that background feeling of expanding in love and creativity and greater success and greater contribution. So if life has that moment-by-moment feeling, I know I'm on the right path. So I just to kind of summarize what we're talking about, instead of going home at 4 o'clock, what I'd like you to do right now is to cultivate the feeling of going home at 4 o'clock and finding out what's in the way of you feeling that right now with whatever you're doing, whether it's computing numbers or shaking a hand or driving to meet a new client. My invitation would be to imbue each moment of life with what you feel most here to do so that you become a living example of your life purpose. And if you do that, I can guarantee that every sales call you make will be a total success.
Well, that's very, very powerful. And I want to take an opportunity to summarize that and kind of encapsulate it into the business and industry that most of our listeners live and breathe every day. But I also am aware of the fact that you have a physical therapy appointment that you need to go to, so I want to be super respectful and mindful of your time. And what I'll do is I'll stick around after you leave for your appointment, and I'll do a summary for the listeners to conclude the call. One last question before you depart and leave us is if you could just take a moment to, you've continued to reference, the 4 quadrants of the zone of incompetence, competence, excellence, and genius, which I am a huge proponent of and have been teaching myself from having read your fantastic book. If you could take a moment to just summarize each of those 4 areas that we can reside in and what the difference is in your view on them, that would be a really wonderful way to conclude our time together.
Yes, well, you alluded to my physical therapy. Your listeners may not know I've been in the process for a couple of months. It's been since I had my left knee replaced, and so I've been rehabbing my left knee, and I have another month or so of kind of twice a week physical therapy to go to, but and it's coming along just fine. But it in the thing that really is important is to stay out of the bottom 2 quadrants. If you picture 4 quadrants, the bottom 2 are the zones of incompetence and the zones of competence. So ask yourself, what do I do every day that somebody else could do better than I can? That's your zone of incompetence. Then your zone of incompetence is, what do I do every day, every hour, every 10 minutes that I'm good at, but somebody else could do it just as well? Mm-hmm. The top 2 quadrants, those have a real luminosity to them. The zone of excellence, the more successful you go, the more you'll spend time in your zone of excellence. If numbers are your friend, you'll be drawn more to numbers. If sales is your friend, you'll be drawn more to sales. Whatever your particular talents are that you're perfecting, that you've gone to school to learn, et cetera, et cetera. So those will often lead you to getting better and better and better. But often what we're talking about, Tim, is something that often happens at midlife around, say, 40 to 45. By the way, I should mention that Kathleen and I have just finished and are in the process of editing our new book, which is a new conscious loving for people at midlife and beyond. And so it's applied to all the couples we've worked with in the 45 to 75 age bracket. So the zone of excellence, we've seen it come to expression so many times in so many couples at midlife. Then there needs to be grown a new version of yourself after midlife that will create more opportunity for you to ask the big questions, to live in your zone of genius, to really find out what life is all about. From around 45 or 50 onwards, you live in what Erik Erikson, the great developmental psychologist, calls a developmental crisis of generativity versus stagnation. so that you're either inventing new things and creating new things, or you're sliding, you're slip sliding, you're staying in one place, but the rest of the world is going further. So to stay out of that, make a big commitment to spending that 10 minutes a day in your zone of genius. Read a little bit more of The Big Leap, find out what it is, but get in that zone of genius at least 10 minutes a day, and then that 10 minutes a day will lead to 20 or 30 or a lifetime. It was about 25 years ago that I made the commitment to spend at least half my time in my zone of genius. It took me years to get to the place where I was spending 70% of my time. Now I'm in my zone of genius all the time, or moving around from place to place to express it. So many blessings to you, and I hope this has been useful to you and your listeners. And thanks a lot for being guided by the wisdom of The Big Leap.
My goodness, thank you so much. Really a pleasure to finally meet you, and my blessings to you, and looking forward to reading the newest version of Conscious Loving. Terrific book that I've read twice, as I think I told you before we got on the phone here. And thank you so very much, Gay. I really appreciate it, and best of luck in your rehabilitation today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Tim.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
So what I'd like to do, folks, is I'd like to take a moment to summarize a couple of things that I heard Gay say that I think were really important. And it was a great learning for me. And I've been teaching the 4-quadrant model of the Genius Zone now for a couple of years, and it's a huge part of the Leadership 360 program, as well as the concept of Einstein time that's in the Big Leap as well. But the big takeaway for me today that I really want to hammer home for all of you is what I heard him say was that it's not about coming home at 4 o'clock. In fact, I'm going to embellish, because this is the awareness that I had when he was describing that, is what is it that we're trying to really accomplish by getting home earlier? For some of us, it's to be able to say that we got home earlier. For others, it's to be able to connect with our children more. For others, it would be to go get a workout in. For others, it would be to connect with our spouse more deeply. And what I heard Gay saying is that, in reading through the lines, is that it's not the act of getting home at 4 o'clock that's going to give you that experience that you're seeking. It's like, if I make $1 million, then I'll finally be happy. We tend to attach these goals to happiness, the goal of getting home at 4 o'clock, the goal of making a certain amount of money. It's like I've told many of my clients, I will get you home at 4 o'clock. That's not the hard part. I'll help you create systems of efficiency and discipline to get you home much earlier than you're coming home. Now, the question is, will you know who you are, and will you know how to be when you get home? And what he is saying very clearly in my mind is that the goal of coming home at 4 o'clock that I've fallen into the trap of, and many others I'm sure have that are listening to this call as well, is the goal is to have this experience. But why do you need to come home at 4 o'clock to have it? And I think that that's what he's really saying is, don't fall into the trap and the illusion that you need to make a certain amount of money or have a certain structure to your day to have the experience that you're seeking to have. Put on your dashboard your awareness of the experience, and then give that self to yourself throughout the day in everything that you do. That's what the genius is really about. So it's like, what is that one, or what are those 1 or 2 things that you do so well, where time stands still, where there's grace and ease in the activity, where you feel full, not drained, but energetically uplifted. And for all of us, it's something different. For me, I'm doing it right now. Why do I do these interviews? Because I love it. It's not work. I don't charge anybody for them. I do them because I just enjoy the process. So this is a perfect example of it. Is what is it that you can do, or what are the couple of things, as he posed, ponder the question, what is my genius, and sit with it. And I'll go a step further. Sit with it for longer than the 15 seconds if you need to. Sit with it for days, for weeks. That's what I've done. I find that as it continues to unfold and manifest, I know it when I experience it. Oh, I'm in it right now. Okay, it's those 2 or 3 things. And that's really what we teach in our Leadership 360 program is let's take this year to uncover it. Let's not try to box it into a 5-minute segment. Let's just let it unfold. Let's continue to ponder the question and allow God and the universe to just deliver and make it very clear to us. And then let's spend as much time in that space as we possibly can within our business, within our personal life, with our friends, with our family. And when we're doing the things that we love to do, the best version of ourselves tends to show up. And then we're magnetic, we're filled up, and the people that experience and encounter us as being full, they benefit as well. I hope that this call has been valuable to you. I want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving because that's coming up. And we'll be back in December with another interview in the Coach's Corner. Go read The Big Leap. You will be very, very happy you did. I don't have anybody in the 35 or 40 people that are my clients that have read it. Every single person's come back to me and just said, wow, that was a huge book for me. Thanks for listening, and happy holidays, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.